Okay, so welcome to the Ladder of Wisdom and Hoshivar podcast. We are glad to have our first interview with one of the most respected and well-known scientists. I give you a brief introduction to both of these podcasts that me, Tannaz, and Masood are running. The first one is the Ladder of Wisdom. Both of them are in Persian language, but in the first one, we talk about the behavioral and the root of our behavior of the human from the psychological and genetic and biology and evolution. I'm a biologist, Tannaz is a psychologist. We try to find the root cause of some of the good behaviors and the bad behaviors considering Iranian culture. In the Hoshivar, I try to explain a book, summarize a book related to brain, human behavior, genetics, evolution, and biology. Recently, I summarized both of your books, like Behave and also Determined, to Iranians as the Persian language with my own words. But I give a brief introduction to our guest, Professor Sapolsky. As a boy, he dreamed of living inside the African diorama in New York's Museum of Natural History. By age 21, he made to Africa and joined a troop of baboons because they are a perfect model for learning about stress and human behavior. He's a MacArthur Genius Fellow, a professor in biology, neurology, and neurosurgery at Stanford University, and a research assistant at the National Museum of Kenya. He is the author and co-author of several hundred scientific articles about stress, human behavior, and gene therapy. Besides his fantastic scientific career, he is the author of several best-selling books, including A Primate Memoir, Why Zebra Don't Get Ulcer, The Trouble with Testosterone, Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, and recently Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. Behave has been recognized as one of the best books of 2017 by Washington Post, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and New York Times bestseller. Dr. Sapolsky's lectures on human behavior has been viewed and discussed by many intellectuals and scientists. Before I start the first question, I give a brief introduction to myself. I'm an Iranian-Canadian biologist. I have a PhD in molecular and medical genetics, graduated from University of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I have done a postdoc at Ottawa Hospital Research Institute working in gene editing, in stem cells, including iPSC. I'm currently a senior scientist in a biotech company working on a cell and gene therapy field. Tannaz?
This is Tannaz. I'm an Iranian-American psychologist. I have PhD in psychology and working on a postdoc degree in clinical psychology. I've been teaching psychology courses for years, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
This is Masood. I'm an Iranian human rights activist. It's my honor to be among the scholars like you guys.
Great. All three of us are very honored to welcome the one and the only Professor Sapolsky to this interview. Professor Sapolsky, before we start question, anything you want to start with?
No, other than I'm delighted to be here and thank you for asking.
Thank you, Robert. Let's start with your book, Behave. How did you get interested in studying human behavior in the first place? And in your opinion, why studying human behavior is important?
Well, I mostly study human behavior as a hobby. I'm not terribly interested in humans. I'm much more interested in baboons or gorillas or lab rats. But, if you really want to understand what baboons are about, at some point you have to notice these 8 billion people around you and start trying to make sense of them. What my view is of it is, we're biological organisms. We humans, we paramecia, we worms, we everything in between. And to understand our behavior has to be in a biological context. which is not saying genes explain everything, which is not saying neurobiology explains everything, which is not saying anything going on in here is independent of the societal context, the psychological context, that they're one and the same. They're completely intertwined. And if you want to understand human behavior, it's a big challenge because we're a very strange species.
Tanas, do you have let's start your question? You're on mute, Tanas.
Robert, how can the insights from your book, Behave, be applied to improve mental health and therapeutic interventions?
Well, I'm not sure if it's that good for therapeutic interventions. Where I think it's hopefully most useful is, mental health. Mental illness is like a leading cause of disability, of misery, of everything on this planet. And it still has a very strong social stigma. And the more people can think about, this is biology just gone out of control. If somebody has type 1 diabetes and they need to take insulin, they don't feel shamed for it. You don't say, oh, come on, stop babying yourself, show some tenacity and self-discipline, and you won't need this insulin stuff. It's a biological disorder. And getting people to view depression and anxiety disorders and everything else that comes with it, and psychoses and such, all that getting people to view these as biological problems can do is to get people to not feel shame, to get people to not be stigmatized by society, to get people to get help, and for them to get better, more effective help.
So what I get, is you're trying to replace the word mental illness to biological problems. This is what you're referring to?
In a sense, psychobiological, social, psychobiological, they're all so completely intertwined that absolutely, we're about 200 years past people viewing a case of tuberculosis as embarrassing and shameful. We're about 100 years past people viewing cancer as something you don't tell people you have because somehow it's contagious. We're, making progress on all these fronts. Mental health issues remain one of the areas of the biggest problems with that.
Okay, Robert. Considering psychology and neuroscience, what are the limitations of current neuroscience psychology in explaining human behavior?
Well, it's enormous problems. It's gigantic ones. I think a few ways of describing what the challenges are within the very neuroscience realm. We're pretty good these days at understanding what is going on at the level of single neurons, the genes within them, the biochemistry of single. We're pretty good, we're getting better at the level of brain imaging. What does a particular brain injury look like in someone? What part of the brain does a particular psychiatric disorder map onto? What's a gigantic problem is branching, going between the levels of single neurons and genes and the organism, the systems biology level, because everything that's going on in this one neuron that has something to do with this behavior, there's 100 million neurons in between. And each of those neurons has 50,000 synaptic connections. And it's at that level that it's just become impossible. And where the technology has moved faster than the understanding. You can see what 20,000 different genes are doing in 20,000 different individual neurons these days with some of the technology available. And nobody knows how to think about it because it's too intuitively inaccessible. So that's one major problem. Another major one is, every logical evolutionary model, psychological model, whatever, coming up for trying to understand human behavior, we always come up with exceptions because we're such a weird species. Broad models have so little predictive value about individual human behaviors. Every sex difference in the brain, the amount of overlap in the distributions is enormous. Every genetic fact that we know is about a tendency, is about a vulnerability, is about a proclivity. We're really complicated. And for my purposes, trying to understand humans, often the biology of humans being terrible to each other, we've got this gigantic problem that we are the most violent, awful, miserable species on this planet. And at the same time, we're the most altruistic and caring and cooperative. And often it's the same person who is capable of both. And often it's one behavior, and which of it counts as depends on how you're viewing it. Oh my God, a baboon is so much easier than us. Making sense of it. I would say the last challenge is one implicit in us talking, which is, is this a biological disorder or is this a psychological disorder? Is this a psychological disorder or is this a societal one? They're all the same. They're all intertwined, and saying something, for example, is a psychological disorder is just a way of saying we have a better understanding of that at this level these days. And psychotherapy might be a better way of changing neurotransmitter receptor levels these days than a drug. Saying something is a neurobiological problem with behavior is just a way of saying we understand more about what's happening down at the receptor level than what. It's just which tools are better for getting at the exact same system. And it's the same exact thing when you're saying things like, why does how you were treated by society or your socioeconomic status has something to do with your risk of psychiatric disorders? It's just you're not going to get governments to try to do things better about depression and anxiety by forcing government leaders to think about neurotransmitter levels. You get them to think about inequality in society or things like that. You're not, it's just which level works best.
One more question. So speaking of neurotransmitters, learning more about all these chemical hormones, so do you think that neuroscience will take over psychology?
Absolutely. At the same time that psychology will take over neuroscience. People have been having this, is it nature, is it nurture, is it psychological or is it biological? They're one and the same, unless you're studying, I don't know, the neurobiology of cockroach social behavior. You got to think you can't understand anything about the workings of the brain outside the context of the mind that brain has produced and outside the context of the society in which that person, brain and mind are functioning. None of them are going to take over the other, but it certainly is a tradition of the more reductive sciences to claim that eventually they're going to take over all the higher levels, so that every psychologist thinks they could be a real scientist if only they studied biology, and every biologist thinks they could finally be a real scientist if only they were a chemist, and then the chemists want to be physicists, and the physicists want to be mathematicians, and the mathematicians only talk to God, and you've got this view that the more reductive you get, the better the science is. Absolutely not the case.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robert. If you don't mind, we switch from the neuroscience, but use the neuroscience to the politics. As we discussed in chapter 15, the metaphors we kill by of your book, Behave. Mentioning the anti-Islam cartoons, the examples you gave us, genocide in Rwanda, and also the Battle of the Gettysburg in Minnesota, and more examples you gave us. We do have the same situation in Iran, where the government tortures and executes innocent people simply because of the way they think or they want freedom. How do you think we should deal with this situation?
Well, first off, thank God there are people like you trying to deal with that situation, as opposed to us who sit in laboratories and think about nonsense rather than actually doing something with real people. I think, okay, ways of getting at it sort of from a biological perspective is recognizing that people are willing to kill for and die for things that make no sense whatsoever, for symbols, for emotional connections, for things of that sort. In terms of, I mean, this anthropologist, Scott Atran, has used this term sacred values. People are willing to live under worse conditions in order to maintain their sacred values. And like people, you know, economists for decades have been saying, ooh, we are not rational beings when we make economic decisions. We are not rational beings when we make decisions out of who we will die for, who we will kill for, who we are willing to live under more severe circumstances for. You know, so first off is understanding the power of that. Neurobiologically, the power of that comes from the fact that the part of our brain that processes symbols, the parts of our brain, evolved to process real things. Disgusting tastes generate very powerful physiological responses. And suddenly we're a species in which disgusting moral acts generates the exact same physiology, the exact same power. We have a brain where someone else's pain, there's neurons in parts of our brain that cannot tell the difference between the pain of a loved one and the pain we are experiencing. That is not a metaphor. You stick an electrode into one of those neurons and it will be responding exactly the same. This tells you it has an enormous power. It tells you these parts of the brain are not very smart, in the sense of, if this part of the brain that is central to deciding if this person's political view is disgusting and immoral and that one is sacred, you're using a part of the brain that evolved to tell if food tastes spoiled or rotten. Like, do not let emotional assessments like that convince you that they make a lot of sense. I think in that regard, I mean, certainly in a place like Iran, and certainly in a place like the United States, which is on the edge of perhaps re-electing Trump, and all of us sitting there and saying, what's wrong with people? What's wrong with people? A key thing that I've come to sort of accept is you cannot use logic and reasoning to change the opinion of someone who formed their opinion without logic or reasoning. You cannot reason somebody out of a stance that they were not reasoned into in the first place. And until you recognize the role of fear, the role of anxiety, the role of, is the future a scary place or not? Is the past a place you remember incorrectly as paradise? is novelty a threatening thing? Is novelty an exciting thing? Like you're not going to change anything until you get at that level. And much as why did this brain just produce this behavior? Because of the neurobiology of 1 second ago, and the environmental stimuli of 1 minute ago, and the hormones from an hour ago, all the way back. Why is this mess what it is? Because of the government now, which is the way it is in response to this injustice in the past, which was in response to that injustice even further, and just like putting all of that in a historical context. I mean, like if trying to make sense of like, why is Iran such a repressive mess in so many ways? On a certain level, like as a neurobiologist saying, why did that behavior occur? Oh, because of this genetic event, and when this person was a fetus, because of this cultural event, because the American CIA overthrew Mossadegh in the 1950s. Oh, like if you want to understand, that had something to do with that. Because of colonialism, because like a country has the shitty, terrible luck of turning out to have a lot of oil, and suddenly the West, so nothing makes sense outside the context of history. Nothing makes sense outside the context that people make their views out of fear and emotion and irrationality, and that people are willing to do incredibly heroic and incredibly brutal things about irrational beliefs.
This is human, yes, Robert.
Yes, I have another question, but maybe at the end I will ask you. Just I want you, what message of support can we all offer? Can we send to the Iranian people who have suffered so much under this government over the past 45 years?
Don't waste your time hating them, because you had no control over the sort of person you became, and they had no control over the sort of person they became. All that hating them does is use up your energy and make you tired. You are not alone. Amid them having all sorts of tools that are powerful ways of monitoring you and controlling you and all of that, there's never been a time in history where large populations of people without power can collectively have power, and actions that go upward rather than downward. Use every bit of social media, use every bit of, and we have entered a world in which a whole bunch of people with cell phones can overthrow tyrants. And this is a very new thing in history. This is no longer people having to be like slaughtered at the gates to the castle. This is this totally strange world, and single governments will never have more power in that sort of world than a whole lot of people working collectively without a centralized authority. Bottom up is going to win every time if you do it right and if you're patient enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. It was great. So I had a question about what maybe we are switching back and forth, Robert, between some of the human rights or politics and science. Before we go to your book, Determine, I have a question because I work in the same field and I read some other opinions about that. Coming back to what you said, and also Tanna's asked about the future research about human behavior to find out the basis of human behavior from genetics. You know that maybe the polygenic score that, for example, Professor Pluming is talking about, the traits that is 50% hereditary, or like and also the nature, how this nature responds to the nature is also nature. So this kind of thing, or whole genome sequencing. So what you see the future research in human behavior, besides the neuroscience and psychology, my field of study is like you see more polygenetic score coming to play to see why people are different, or whole genome sequencing, this kind of new technology. I would like to see your opinion about these new technologies in the next decade or so.
I think as soon as we are in a world where we can look at gene expression in single cells and thousands of different genes, as soon as we can look at the epigenome and realize that environment has changed the function of thousands of different genes, and even at the level of in this cell in a different way than in that cell. And the second you do that, and the second you look at the results of any GWAS of something interesting, and there's 500 different genes implicated that collectively explain 6% of the variability, you're not just going to be able to throw these amazing new techniques and just strong arm your way through being able to understand where this stuff comes from. I mean, the gene environment interactions are on a scale that are beyond imagination. Heritability scores mean nothing whatsoever. And I like torture my students. I spend 2 or 3 lectures trying to take them through the notion that all a heritability score means is what genes have to do with the variance of this trait in the places where it has been studied already. And it tells you nothing about anywhere else where it has been studied, because what every one of those things show you is it's going to produce an unexpected gene environment interaction that could even go in the opposite direction of what all the heritabilities, so that someone like Robert Plomin, he has something to say about the realm in which something was studied. And that might tell you something about like the behavior of penguins, because you don't find penguins living in the Sahara or the Amazon, and you don't find, giant sloths living, but we humans are living in every ecosystem and every social system and every economic system and every religion and ideology and all of that. Like, there's no species on Earth in which there's a stronger lesson that if you have found out something about what genes have to do with behavior, you have found out what those genes have to do with behavior in that setting only. And we're capitalist, we're socialist, we're polygamist, we're monogamist, we're secretly polygamous, we're, everything. It tells you that's a very, very seductive direction to take in the future if you think that's going to tell you a whole lot just by throwing these massive techniques. I mean, I'm sure like you saw the period where if somebody could say they were a bioinformatics person, they instantly got a faculty position and got tenure because, bioinformatics was just going to explain everything, how you could record from 3,000 different neurons at once, or you could track gene expression. And what you saw was like, that gives you no intuition for how it works. I mean, my students, I throw at them, like, I cannot make sense of this stuff. And when you throw in the level of information that you get, and when you throw in chaoticism and nonlinear interactions of component parts and emergent complexity, and you throw all that stuff in there, I tell them, you guys can't understand it either. With any luck, your grandchildren who become scientists will be able to think in 7 dimensions at once and have intuitions about it. You guys could probably do 4 or 5 dimensions. I'm lucky if I can do 3. We don't have the means to be intuitive yet about the amount of information we can get. And like, I'm going to be long dead, and all of us, like, it's just going to be a scale of thinking. I cannot make sense of graphs where you look at them and they're actually like, they rotate the figure because they're doing it 5-dimensionally, and it's beyond me. And everything that's interesting is way more dimensions than that. And all genetics is going to do is make that point more strongly. And all amazing electrophysiological techniques where you can record from, or all brain imaging techniques where you can, instead of seeing what 100,000 neurons are doing once as a pixel on the screen, whoa, you can now see what 10,000 neurons at once are doing. None of those are going to do it because we can't think intuitively yet about it beyond saying it's complicated. So I think the people who are going to be just as excited about how the whole world could be explained or recreated with CRISPR are going to be making the same mistakes as the people who, I don't know, 30 years ago could get positions because they knew how to do a radioimmunoassay. Like,
Yes. Yeah.
you know,
This is complex, yeah, Robert. I think you talk about, for example, the hormone oxytocin in a contextual way. So oxytocin does something in one environment and does something else in another environment. It's a multidimensional and multifactorial. It's not a single, like as you said, we look this way, we have to look at all 7 dimensions, maybe you mentioned, and maybe, but we don't have that technology, or at least we don't have intuition to understand everything, as you said.
Absolutely. And like, you know, you sit, I'm sure you sit in like your biotech place, or I would sit in a faculty meeting and you're discussing a new hire. And it's maybe, I don't know, 3-4 years ago that people stopped saying, oh, there's this kid who's applying for the position, coming out of Harvard, coming out of MIT. They're a CRISPR person. Ooh, we could use a CRISPR person. There's a multi-equilibrium ecology person. And they know, yeah, we need one of them. 5 years from now, everyone's going to be doing it, and it won't have solved they're still on some occasions going to have to go talk to the plant biologists, even though they're ecosystem monitoring with satellites, or they're going to have to go talk to psychologists. They're going to like any of these things. Yeah, techniques are great. I don't understand 90% of the techniques that occur in a paper in Science or Nature anymore. I'm way too old for that, but you know.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. I think for the directive, we have lots of questions about behavior, your book, but I think because of the sake of time, but here maybe, can we get a promise from you that we talk to you maybe in a few months again? Because we couldn't cover lots of your research in the last 40 years about stress, cortisol, testosterone, or other things. And because of the importance of your new book, we want to switch to that now, but could you please give us a promise that we can talk to you maybe in a few months?
Sure. Yes, definitely.
Great. Okay, my colleagues are smiling. They are happy as well. Okay, so let's now go to second part of the interview as we move to the newly published book, Determined. So even though all 4 of us may be predetermined to be here in this Zoom meeting or not, maybe we can ask Robert. Let's move to this book. So Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. This book has been well received by scientists, philosophers during the last 8-9 months that since it's published. Also raised some serious critics, mostly from compatibilist philosophers, that also they believe in like a determinism, but some still believe in free will, and some of them alarm about the possible toxic or even dangerous consequences related to the free will if we don't have it, mainly about the meaning of the life, moral responsibilities, so on. To open the discussion, Robert, I start with maybe 2 questions. I think one of the main challenges that I see, that I have seen lots of your interview and discussions, argument with other philosophers, scientists, is a definition of free will, especially between incompatibilists, like hard incompatibilists like you, and the compatibilists like Dan Dennett or Kevin Mitchell. So what is your definition of free will? And to what extent you think the battle is due to the different definition of interpretation of free will? Because they interpret that up to the last second or whatever, after that, we have we free will to decide. So, but even the agency or the control that we have, they raise that as a free will. But how you discuss is all way up to the end from the beginning. So could you please define what do you mean by free will?
Oh God, that. Well, by now, I've been arguing with enough people for the last 9 months that I'm realizing all the ways in which I should have been a lot clearer. I think what helps me the most is looking at where people get in trouble and find free will where there is not, what they're using as a definition for it in their mind, which is we make decisions. We make decisions, we form an intent about something, and we decide to act on it. And we understand that we are choosing to do that, and we understand what the consequence is likely to be. And most of all, we understand that we don't have to be doing that. We could be doing this instead or that instead, that there are multiple possible futures. And for most people, that qualifies as free will. That's enough. That's where it is both necessary and sufficient. You have an intent, you can consciously act on it, and you know you have alternatives. You don't have to do it. And the American legal system, that is enough grounds for putting someone to death. That is enough grounds for, any of those things. And that has nothing to do with the question of free will, because it ignores the entire issue of how did you turn out to be the sort of person who would form that intent at that moment? And some of the time that's on a very narrow level. So why do you like vanilla ice cream more than chocolate ice cream? How did you become that sort of person? That's ridiculous. How did you become the sort of person who would have the ideology that you do? How would you become the sort of person with the emotional makeup out of it? How did you form that intent in that moment? And when you frame it that way, just saying, ooh, did that person intend to do that? And did they know they could have done something else? That's like telling somebody what a book is about only after you have read the last sentence of it, because you've missed everything that has brought that person to that moment. Stated a different way, because you were missing how everything that person is at that moment is an outcome of the biology interacting with environment from 1 second ago and 1 hour ago and from a lifetime ago and all of that, which is another way of saying that all we are is the sum of the biology that we had no control over and its interactions with environment that we had no control over. And given framing in that way, show me a neuron, show me a part of the brain, show me an entire brain, show me an entire person who's just carried out a behavior completely free from its history, and you've just proven there's free will. And you can't, because nothing we do is free of everything that has brought us to who we are in this moment, who we are, what genes are active, who we are, what levels of neurotransmitter receptors, who we are, what political beliefs, who we love, who we hate, show me a mechanism by which behavior occurs independent of our history, and you've just proven free will. You have shown that something can be a cause and not be caused by anything. And none of the compatibilists can do that. They go on and on about, ooh, you can't prove that there was no free will in this. You people who do not believe in free will, prove to us there's no free will. Prove to us there's no Santa Claus. Prove to us that, there still are dinosaurs somewhere in New Jersey. Prove to us that by now we know enough about how people come to be who they are in this moment that the pressure should be on the philosophical compatibilists. Show me how it works. Show me how this behavior just occurred that is free of everything that came before. And then you've shown this free will. And until you can do that, you were showing you were just very emotionally upset by the idea that there is no free will. And they can't do it. And by now, they're the ones who should be showing how this stuff works, rather than the people who say there's no free will. Ooh, prove there's no free will. Show me how it works. Oh.
No. I was talking to Tanaz and Masood that Robert has a dog, because I have seen in few like interviews that you have, or arguments, that his dog is very close to you. Anyway, it was great, Robert. So coming to your point, still some scientists or philosophers argue that your hypothesis of not having free will, that you are saying that they have to show it, is not possible to falsify. So coming back to Popperian philosophy, so how you think maybe your hypothesis, is it possible to be experimentally tested in the lab? Or when you are saying show me, so means they have to show experimentally in the lab, or is it possible that this can be falsified?
Well, my argument, of course, is by now the compatibilists are the ones who have to defend themselves from the argument of this is an unfalsifiable stance. I think every time we show a very important biological fact that if people do or do not drink coffee in the morning, they are going to be more or less alert and better at doing frontal tasks. Every time you can show whether or not someone had coffee this morning, and then knowing what culture they were raised in, whether they are going to be better at this type of frontal task or that type of frontal task. Every time we know something about whether somebody had coffee this morning, what culture they were raised in, and how they felt about their parents and what that did to the size of their amygdala, we're going to have some understanding as to why they are good at frontal tasks or not today, and why this particular frontal task. And if they're not good at it, why afterward they're going to blame themselves or blame those immigrants taking our jobs, or blame, at each level of this, you're showing more predictive power. And at some point, you take a person who is floridly schizophrenic and you do something to their brain, blocking dopamine receptors, and they become less schizophrenic. Or you take a culture of people who are living amid inequality and fear, and you do something to decrease the inequality and fear, and they become kinder to each other. At any of these levels, you've just shown, you put all those pieces together from this level to this, and like if you could explain why like early trauma does this or that to growth factor expression, epigenetics in this part of the brain, and at the same time show why inequality makes people more likely to abuse their children, like you put all those pieces together and stop at asking people like me about falsifiability. Ask the compatibilists.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yes. Just for audience, so Robert has been published a review in Scientific American a few years ago talking about inequality and how inequality affects our behavior. I highly recommend, if you have time, read that review. I'm going to discuss about that review in my next episode of Hoshiwar, when I talk about Robert H. Frank book, Success and Luck. So I will cover part of this inequality from this paper. So I will put a link maybe in the YouTube note. You can maybe have access to that Scientific American. Thank you, Robert. So Tanaz, go ahead. You have a few questions.
Yeah, Robert, with all that said, as psychologist or college professor, how do we explain to people, to everyone, that we don't have free will and we are not responsible for our actions?
Maybe that little problem. I don't know. I've been trying to do that for 50 years without a huge amount of success. Because I've thought this way for a long, long time. Maybe almost as an exercise endlessly with people, when someone makes a judgment about someone, whether positive or negative, when someone makes a judgment, just to ask them, how did they become that way? How did they become a criminal? How did they become such a successful CEO? Where did that come from? And take them through the steps and teach them which of those steps are ones that this person that you're talking to knows nothing about, because they were born with running water, because they were born like, oh, I had no idea that this could be part of the experience of growing up. Oh, I had no idea that there's neurological diseases that will make people do that. Oh, I had no idea that other people have had life experiences that are so different from mine. And it's not to make them be better at perspective taking and all of that. If at the end of the day, the main thing you could convince people is that if you have decided you know why somebody just did what they did, whether it's wonderful or terrible, and you want to reward them or punish them or whatever, if you think you understand why they did what they did, you're probably wrong, because you don't understand enough about how they became who they are. Maybe on that level. And it's been occurring to me that where this should mostly be directed is towards children. Because, like, someone says something complimentary to me, and I've got 67 years of conditioning for me to say, oh, thanks, that's nice, and then stop and say, wait, how did I get to where I am? Like, you got to get kids with that. It strikes me one of the exercises almost that needs to be done is to get people to the point where someone does something nice for you, and instead of saying to them, I am so grateful that you helped me, to say, I am so grateful that circumstances turned you into the sort of person who would be in a position to help me. And you do.
I like that.
It's hard. We do an everyday version of it when someone does something nice and you're trying to like do something subtle about it. And you say, tell your mother she did a good job. That's a way of saying, oh, I'm very glad due to maternal influences starting in fetal life, you turned out to be this sort of person. Like, we can kind of do that sometimes. That one's said as a joke. That's what we should tell the world, that I'm very grateful that all of those things you had no control over happened to turn you into this sort of person. And if people start saying that enough, the other person who you've just said that to is going to feel pretty silly saying, wow, I'm great. I'm grateful I turned out to be this way. I'm grateful I turned out to have the ability to do this or whatever. And if you really want to push people to an extreme with that psychologically, like, how can you get people to the point where they're grateful that that's happened to be the sort of person they turned out to be? Wow, it is so great that I just happened to be the sort of person who could take out brain tumors, or that I turned out to be the sort of person who could work hard for 20 years of training to be able to take out brain tumors. Whoa, I am so grateful. I don't know how it works this way, but somehow my fingers can do this on a keyboard so that people in the audience cry from the emotions that what the hell is this? How did this happen? It's cool. I'm grateful. Like,
You know, Robert, this is exactly what the religion people use, but they use another word. For everything, they said, thanks God, I have you. Thanks God, this has happened. Which God? Yeah, and you replace the free will, illusion of free will with the God. Am I right?
thank luck, thank randomness, thank chaos and emergence and multiple levels of explanation. That, you know, that's great that I turned out this way, that I can do good. That's a good thing. Gratitude, you know, there's this psychologist at UC Berkeley, Dacher Keltner. He's a really good scientist and he's a really great guy. And he does research on gratitude. And it's a very empowering thing. And the interaction between gratitude and awe, you make people like write a paragraph, spend the next 10 minutes writing on this paper about a time where you felt a sense of awe versus a time you felt a sense of impatience or you felt a sense of accomplishment. And when people think about awe and when they begin to feel grateful and when they begin to feel really small in the context of everything out there, people become less entitled. They show more humility. They become more generous in an economic game immediately afterward. You know, those are good ways if constantly you were thinking, before I judge this person, how did they become who they are? And if constantly your mindset is, whoa, so it's just by sheer chance that I wound up being good at this. Where'd this come from? Whatever, you know, maybe those are ways to begin to undo that. All of that's in the context, you know, I sit and like I give a lecture to a bunch of people who are willing to come out in an evening and listen to some professor talk for an hour or somebody's podcast for people interested in philosophy and religion. You're talking to the people who are very, very lucky. If they can come to a lecture at night, if they can listen to a podcast and instead they're working 3 jobs to keep from being evicted from their home, you're talking to the people who are the lucky ones. And by definition, those are the people who have been treated better than average because of things they had no control over. For most people, when you look at the particular domains, they've been treated worse than average because of things they had no control over. And like, those are the people, you know, it's not your fault that you're poor. It's not your fault that you have a completely crappy frontal cortex because you were raised with terrible adversity. It's not your fault that you were born with a ethnicity or a skin color or whatever. So you walk into a room and in under a tenth of a second, people's amygdalas respond in a certain way because of your face, because you know, for most people, getting rid of free will is freeing, is liberating, because when you look at it, most people are treated poorly at various points in their lives for things they had no control over. And if what you're mostly doing is writing books and articles and giving philosophical lectures to people who, for the most part, have been treated better than average because of things they had no control over, they've got a pretty strong emotional investment in believing they earned what they have.
One more question, Robert. I want you to talk about criminals. I want to see how we can distinguish between criminals, the one with mental illnesses and the one without, the brain with psychological illnesses and the one without. So how can we distinguish between these 2 types of people?
I think the answer is there is no distinction. There is no distinction. If it was 100 years ago, we would have no idea that a concussive head injury to the frontal cortex can change somebody's behavior enough that half the judges in this country would say, okay, there's organic impairment You can't jail this person. They had no control. But then we invented neuropsych tests. Then we invented brain imaging. And now there's a whole bunch of realms where there used to be this divider between, okay, if somebody's blind, they'll bump into you. It's not their fault. If somebody's done this behavior, they're evil. Then we invent neuroimaging, and we now put the line here. And then we're going to invent something else, and we're going to put the line there and the line there and the line there until, by definition, no matter what you could show on a brain scan or a psych inventory or whatever, by definition, you do not become a damaging person unless you were damaged somewhere along the way. Maybe you were damaged at the time that the egg and the sperm came together. Maybe, all these levels at which damage can be. There is no line. There is no line between us and them, between them and their diseases and us who are healthy. Those of us who are healthy merely have the same diseases that most other people have. So we decide that means that you're healthy. There is no line. And all we've been doing is moving it closer and closer and closer. If you can do something incredibly damaging to another human, it's because something got damaged along the way and you had no control over it. And we simply have much better tools these days for saying, aha, here's the damage. There's a massive lesion in this person's amygdala. That's much easier than saying, on the level, in courtrooms, I do a lot of testimony in murder trials for the defense, trying to explain the brain to juries and why this person wound up with a brain where if you had gone through the life that they had had, at that moment, you would have made the exact same terrible decision and hear what was going on in their brain at the time that wouldn't have happened in your brain and the jury, all of that. You get a singular event. Aha. This person, when they were 12, they were in a car accident that caused massive damage to their frontal cortex, and they have no control over their behavior. About half of juries and about half of people are capable of seeing there is a massive explanation going from that brain injury, a huge iron cable, steel cable of explanation to that behavior. Okay, that's a billion times easier than you look at anybody else, and what you have to see is not a gigantic steel cable from one event, a billion different spider webs of causality from a billion different things that occurred in their past. And that's so much harder because for the most part, we don't know the science yet that could say, oh, that's the source of a spider web. That makes a difference. That hasn't, and because it's really hard to believe that you put all those tiny little spider webs together and it is as big of a steel arc of causality as that single car accident. One car accident, that's easy. One brain injury, one brain tumor, one childhood of continued abuse in foster homes. Those are the easy ones because you could sort of imagine how you got from there to here. For most everybody else, it's a billion different spider webs, and it's very hard for us to think in terms of distributed causality like that. And the notion that when you put all that distributed causality together, it is just as determinative as you put a gun to this person's head and you said, unless you do this, this one's just easier to understand. A massive brain injury is just easier to understand. There's no line between them and us, and there's no line in terms of criminality, and there's no line in terms of people who do wonderful, brilliant, or kind things either. It's the same. Very kind brains do not become kind by chance either. Very smart brains, very creative brains, there's no lines. They're just for convenience. And when we rely on the convenience too much, we do social harm because we believe arbitrary barriers actually mean something.
So we see all the people, even sociopaths, psychopaths, people with like different mental illnesses, if they just commit a crime, we see all them same thing. This is what you say, right? We treat them the same way.
Yeah, there is no person who, because of their behavior, is more worthy of their needs being considered than yours, or who is less worthy, because none of us have earned anything. None of us deserve anything, whether it's a terrible act or it's a wonderful act. And yeah, I know that's incredibly hard to think that way. I decided that when I was 14 years old, and I still can't function that way most of the time. It's incredibly difficult, but that is the reality. You still have to protect society from dangerous people. You still have to protect society to make sure that brain surgeons have been trained so that when they take out your brain tumor, they don't mess it up. You still have to do those things, but you have to separate it from any notion that because this person was violent or because this person is an amazing neurosurgeon, their needs have different values. They have earned anything different, because they really didn't. It's so hard, but that really is the case. And what I'm convinced of by now, almost certainly because I don't give lectures to audiences of sociopaths in prisons, I give lectures to like lucky people sitting there and all of that. Getting people to think that way about violent criminals is going to be very hard. Getting people to think that way about smart people and kind people and successful people is going to be 100 times harder, because that's where people really start getting, wait, I worked really hard for my advanced degree. Whoa, all those nights where my college roommate went out to parties and I studied in all the version, that one's going to be much harder. It's going to be much harder to construct a society without moral meritocracies than it is getting rid of moral punishment. That's easy in comparison, and that's unbelievably hard. Moral meritocracies, that's going to be 1 billion times harder. I'm convinced of that by now, because the only people who listen to like people who think about nonsense like this are people who are having easier lives because of the notion that there is a morality to meritocracy and luck.
Talking about morality, humanity, values, love, kindness, what about all these things? How do you see them?
You know, I can simultaneously, love my wife beyond words and feel grateful while understanding some of the circumstances which made us compatible and some of the circumstances which not, and the luck that brought us together or did not. And maybe it's got something to do with the gene variants of some of my olfactory receptors and what pheromones smell like and what they do to my testosterone. You could simultaneously function on both levels. You can sit there and you can look at like a gazelle leap, and it's the most beautiful thing in the world. And you can also devote your entire life to doing biomechanics and understanding how the angle of their pelvis evolved to make it possible for them to do that. Knowing that there is a structure underneath doesn't make a gazelle jumping any less, making your jaw drop open. It's just stuff functions on multiple levels, and it shouldn't rob it of that. And yeah, we feel love, we feel awe, we feel emotions we don't even have words for, and they didn't come from nowhere. But that does not take away the legitimacy of the power of the feeling at the time. It's made of something. Everything is made of something. That's made of something. Nonetheless, this is a moment of unbelievable pain, or this is a moment where it feels like there's a reason for all this, or, whoa, I had the right, genetic profile interacting with epigenetic, whatever, to have a moment like this and feel as if it's an amazing thing to be alive. Yeah.
And also, let's look at it like this. If someone asks you, what's the meaning of life, your life, what you gonna say?
This is where I've got the biggest problem there. I've got the people who get upset about the notion that there's no free will. It's easy when they go on about how we'll just have criminals running around. No, it's easy when they say, oh, no one will do anything. There'll be nothing can ever change. Don't bother. Those ones are the, where do I find purpose from? Like it really is like this big, empty, indifferent universe where like there's a bunch of atoms that have come together for a while, and each one of us calls that collection of atoms me. And at some point, those atoms are going to come apart again. And like, yeah, it's kind of a tough, it's a tough one with that.
Sorry, we don't have enough time, but at the point, I have to ask an extra question. For example, if I said, Tanaz, I love you as a husband, and she said, it's okay, you don't have any choice, you don't have free will, you have to have loved me. It's not important for me. You don't have another choice except loving me. Am I right?
That is the reality of it. And you could break it down to like your upbringing and, oh, I know why this kind of face wound up appealing to you instead of that kind of face because of this culture you were raised, any of that. Yeah, you could break it down to that. All if you're getting gummed up in the fact that that takes out the vitality, that takes out the juices, that takes out the feeling and all of it. All you can do with that is say, and damn, I am so grateful it turned out that way because like I like your beard, whereas you're a good person because I'm glad I've just spent the last whatever number of years, and your response should just be, let's not look at all the things that brought it to that point. I'm just grateful that that turned out to be that from your direction. I don't know, maybe that's, gratitude makes absolutely no sense in a world in which there's no free will. But still, that's kind of the sustaining thing. Damn, it turned out that I got to spend my life with you. Wow, how great is that? It just turned out that way.
You just changed point of view.
So, Robert, do you think we can continue another 10 minutes and then we can close it here? So you have one. Okay, so I think you promised us to talk to us because we have lots of other questions. But Thanos, do you have another question for Robert following the questions that you had?
Because
like
he already,
biological machine or
most,
robot. Okay.
Yeah, but he already talked most part of it. That's why I'll just skip it. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you talk about the justice system. I think this is an important question, Robert, following what Thanos asked about the moral responsibility. It will also affect our moral judgment. You talk about the blame, punishment, retribution, and prison in your book a lot. And also it seems you are challenging the current legal and judgmental system, not only in US, but also maybe globally. What has been the reaction of the lawyers, judges, and jury members? You talk about the jury that you go to court in some of your interview or even your book. How do you see the future? Maybe gradually these kind of lawyer judgments, jury, they come to the conclusion, okay, they will close the prisons, or what happens? We see in some Scandinavian countries that they close the prisons. That's maybe idealistic, maybe society. But how do you see maybe 50 years from now, if we all accept, okay, we don't have free will?
Well, so far I've been incredibly unsuccessful with juries, things like that. I've worked on 13 murder cases and we've lost 11 of them. And like you sit there with the jury and you explain to them, and like you hope beforehand, great, there's 12 people on the jury. 2 of them are engineers and 1 of them was a science teacher. They can think this way. This is great. This is so, and you talk to them and they're nodding and all of that. And then they go into the jury room and they look at the pictures of the corpse and the blood and all of that. And they convict the guy 30 minutes later, kind of thing. And like I've given lectures about this stuff to judges as well. And they all come out and they say, oh, well, that was really interesting. You know, this is way out there, but, you know, interesting guy, interesting ideas. The challenge is, you know, the only possibility is this is going to be a revolutionary change that's going to happen so slowly it doesn't even count as a revolution. But it happens. In most people, except, you know, people I might have encountered in Kenya over the years, I think most humans on Earth at this point believe that people cannot cast a witchcraft spell and control the weather. We don't think that way anymore. We don't burn people at the stake for that anymore. That's great. That's like some amazing progress we've made in the last 200 to 400 years or so. So that was a step towards the revolution. In, you know, Western Europe, we've figured out in the last 150 years that epilepsy is not a sign of the devil. We figured that out, and our legal system go, whoa, that was pretty good. When I was a kid, I mean, we're all roughly in the same age group. When I was a kid and I would be sitting in school and the kid sitting next to me was not learning how to read very fast, it's obvious what the explanation was to all of us sitting there, to the teacher, to the parents. They're not very smart. They're lazy. They're not very motivated. And then, I don't know, there was a revolution 30, 40 years ago of this thing called dyslexia and learning differences. And whoa, you can even look and the architecture of one part of the cortex is abnormal. And now, you know, you read these like testimonials from 40-year-olds who say, yeah, I got diagnosed with dyslexia last year. God, I wish they had figured that out when I was an 8-year-old. I've spent my entire life hating myself for being lazy. And like every one of these steps, the world has become more humane. So like, it would be great if tomorrow there would be no prisons and no meritocracies and no CEOs getting salaries that are 100 times bigger than the workers and any of that stuff. It would be total chaos and probably a bet. But if a year from now, if we had a chance to think about it, yeah, that would be, it's not going to happen. If, you know, in the last 10 years in the United States, there's been a revolution in people changing how they think about free will, about sexual orientation and sexual identity. And that was unrecognizably different 20 years ago. Wow, stuff is happening. And I'm fascinated by now about how those changes occur. And it has a hell of a lot more to do with some celebrity turning out to be, or the child of some conservative politician turning out to be, and suddenly the politician thinks differently. It has a hell of a lot more to do with it than any stupid scientists teaching us about like the neuroanatomy of sexual orientation. You know, that's occurred in the last 10 years. Maybe one of the biggest stigmas in westernized societies now remain obesity, being overweight. And the vast majority of people still view that as a moral failure, as a failure of self-discipline, as a lack of loving yourself enough, and thus unconsciously you want to eat yourself into self-hatred, or like, oh, there's like screwy leptin receptors in the hypothalamus in some people. Maybe we're going to be 10, 20 years from now. Maybe that's the next one. But with each one of these,
takes time. Yeah, takes time, Robert. I saw in one of your discussions that it seems you are more pessimistic than optimistic about how fast we can improve this. But let's hope for the future. Yeah.
Just don't hope for too much.
Yeah. Because of the time, we had several other questions about the discussion that Dan Dennett had with Greg Crusoe. I think I had questions. Maybe we can keep those for the maybe next talk or interview. But Masood, I give you the opportunity to talk about, because we are also talking about Iran, about you are also a human activist. So maybe we can finish this talk with your question that you had. Maybe you can ask your question about whatever you want. We can close the session.
Okay, thank you. Just I try to be fast as possible. For a long time, man has had a few innovations. For instance, he created God to claim him for not knowing and ask him for his wishes. With the advancement of science, the colors of that illusion of God are fading. Despite much controversy and predestination and free will, man believes in having free will. And no science, science rejects free will as an illusion. Okay. However, since when has this illusion of free will been born in human evolution, and for what purpose? I just mentioned Kevin Mitchell in Free Agents believe the free will is kind of part of our evolution. But in your book, you mentioned about the kids less than 4 years, between 4 years, 6 years, after 6 years, they kind of feeling free will. Before that, maybe they don't know anything about the free will. But is that part of evolution, or is not a part of evolution?
Well, for one thing, I had a debate with Kevin Mitchell during the summer or something, and I wish since then I've understood much better that we're actually talking about two completely different things, and we're just using free will in a very different sense. He's very interested in the fact that, yes, we do make decisions. I'm going to have ice cream instead of salad. I'm going to shoot this person instead of loving them, whatever. We make decisions. And all I think about is, how did you become the sort of person who would have that decision? And what he's interested in is the evolution of how the brain makes a decision in that moment. And it's totally interesting stuff. And I just didn't understand enough of what he was saying at the time. We're talking about two totally different things. And what he's talking about is completely interesting. And it's the evolution of how complex systems make optimal choices. Complex systems, how your thermostat knows that when it's 74 degrees, still keep pumping out heat, and when it's 75, stop. How a single cell organism 4 billion years ago evolved to be able to make a decision. If there's food in this direction, but not in that direction, have your little things, how do you work it so that you go and you make the right decision? You swim. How did control evolve? And his analysis of it is actually really elegant and interesting, and he's totally right, because that's the look. Which organism first evolved a feedback loop telling what the consequences were of the decision to swim this way instead of that way? So on that level, I wish I understood more that we were actually talking about two totally different things, and his stuff is great.
Sorry, I told you, I'm not following the Mitchell. I told you this is different from the Michel thought, you know. The free will, we think we have free will. And exactly like we think we have a God. But now we know why we think that we have a God. And it has application for us, you know, for our life. Many people believe in God and they get some good sense from their life. But free will, why we believe in free will? Which purpose of our life is take us to believe in a free will?
I think evolution is totally relevant here. We could not have evolved to be as smart of a species as we are if we did not evolve a capacity to believe in things that are not true. That there's someone up there who loves us, that we have the power, that we have free will, that there's purpose, all of that. I mean, we're smart enough as a species to know we're all going to stop breathing at some point. We're smart enough. Like, the only way we could have survived as a species is to have evolved a tremendous capacity for self-deceit and rationalization. And free will is just another version of that. And I think one of the most insightful definitions of what major depression is it's a pathological failure of the ability to deceive yourself about the nature of the world and to rationalize away things. We couldn't have lasted as a species, you know, if we didn't evolve that, which is, among other things, why you get much higher rates of depression among people who are atheists than theists, and things that feeding into that. And the awe gratitude angle, I think, is our best hope that people stopping to believe in free will is not a pathway to depression instead, with any luck. But yeah, we had to evolve this. And
I think the time almost over, and maybe talk.
Yeah.
I just want to say, in your language, I must say, thanks our background to let us to be together today. Am I right?
yes, and I am certainly.
Thank you. You are a good teacher.
That's a good thing.
Yes,
So Robert, I talked to Masood and Thanos about your book for almost 7 months, and Masood had an objection, and then we discussed, and then Masood is somehow in line. Still, maybe after today, maybe he will be a little bit different, but I think it's hard. You mentioned in one of your discussions that even though you believe not having free will, we forget. We choose, yes. And also 99%, you mentioned that if somebody kills somebody, we hate the person at the first place. And then, okay, we think, oh no, this guy has a background, whatever. At the first place, we evolved to this way, but it's hard, I agree. Yeah. Anyway, I think final point, Robert, do you want to add?
No, it's great we got to cover all of this. I don't know.
Yeah.
If someone listens to this.
Thank you so much. I think we have more questions, and we can talk about the vetoing, about other things like chaos, quantum physics, but hopefully maybe in the next few months, we can have another session covering some behavior and some other aspect of your book. Thank you so much. It was a great honor for 3 of us again to be with you. And I will send the final link of this to you, and then we will post in the YouTube, and we send the link to you. Again, appreciate and have a great day and have a nice weekend, Robert.
Thanks, you too. I hope the lights stay on and the electricity continues. And this was really fun. So thanks for asking me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.